Around lunchtime on the 31st of July, 2018, my dad and I were waiting in one of the Southwest Airlines gatehouses at the San Diego airport. We were going to be flying to Seattle with a connection in Sacramento. In Seattle, we were going to be spending a week with my dad's former bandmate and friend, Tim. We were also going to be taking a ferry over to Vancover Island and spend a couple of days with their old friends Regan and Doris. We boarded the plane at around 12. We took off 30 minutes later.
We're rotating. Here we go. Come on, come on, come on. We're airborne. We're flying steeply. Good, good, good. Like we should. No climbing. Turning left. Because we're heading north now.
To north and climbed over the ocean. Next, we flew over the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Then the flight attendant served us next. The day I was flying was the last day that Southwest was serving their peanuts. When we got closer to Sacramento, I realized that we were going to be descending through smoke from a series of wildfires occurring at around that time. We began descending at around 1:30.
We are currently flying through smoke now. So it's a little sketchy, but it's not to the air conditioning system. This is not good.
We had kind of a rough landing.
Oh, I can see the treetops. Whoa. Should be on the runway. This is a little sketchy. Hold on. So what the heck are we doing? Oh gosh. This is a little sketchy. What are we doing? Oh, we're on the ground. Here we go. Oh, yeah. Oh, whoa, that was a little bumpy.
We taxied into the gate. In addition to the jetway, we also got to exit the rear via air stairs. We chose the latter because air stairs are pretty cool. This was my first time using them. We entered the terminal using a door located near the entrance of the jetway. We had about 90 minutes before we were supposed to board our connecting flight. We decided to check out some of the terminal. It had a couple pieces of really nice art. Eventually, the aircraft that was going to become our flight landed. When I was taxiing to the gate, I noticed that the aircraft had a special livery. There was a tag painted above the cargo hold that said, "Free bags fly here," promoting Southwest Airlines' free bag policy. Soon we boarded the plane. Our seat was actually located right above the tag. We taxied for takeoff. We left Sacramento at around 4. A few minutes into the flight, as we climbed over the smoke, we were greeted by a wonderful view. The smoke had reflected the dark blue sky, giving it a bluish-gray color. A few clouds onto the horizon added to the beauty. When we could finally see the ground again, we were flying over the temperate rainforest of Western Oregon. After being in the air for 1 hour, we finally passed over the Columbia River into Washington. A few minutes later, we got a spectacular view of 3 of Washington's largest mountains: Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and Mount Adams. Mount St. Helens famously erupted in 1980. Now there's a large crater in the mountain. Mount Rainier is Washington's tallest mountain. Mount Adams is Washington's second tallest mountain, all of which are stratovolcanoes. Eventually, we began our approach into Seattle. We're probably about 600 feet or so. We landed at around 5.
Seattle, here we come!
While taxiing to the gate, we saw a British Airways 747. After traveling for about 5 hours, we arrived at the gate. Tim picked us up and we drove to Tipsy Cow, a really good burger place located in the city. It was located on the first floor of a high-rise complex. We waited outside a little before we got our table. The restaurant had a lot of quotes about cows on the walls. I just got a regular cheeseburger and fries. Dad went very fancy on his burger. Dad also showed off his good humor. That's an evil cow burning down the farmhouse. Afterward, we walked to an ice cream place on the other side of the street. I got cookies and cream since it's one of my favorite flavors. By now, the sun was starting to set. Tim drove us to his high-rise apartment complex located in one of Seattle's suburbs. When we arrived, Tim introduced me to their cats.
This is Thatcher, guys. Yeah.
Aw, he's so cute.
They're both cheese.
He's so cute. Aww.
Afterward, we went to the high-rise's sun deck. It gave us a cool view of the suburb that also had skyscrapers. We went to bed an hour later. Tim's wife would also be returning from a trip the next day. The next morning, we woke up and got ready for a Mariners baseball game. Dad and I took the bus to downtown Seattle. We got off near where Seattle's Chinatown is. While walking to Safeco Field, the baseball field where the Mariners play at, we passed the adjacent Century League field. After walking for 30 minutes, we arrived at the Safeco Field. Tim would be joining us later as he had to go to an important job interview. The stadium had a retractable roof that opens right before a game starts. It's used to protect the stadium from the rain that Seattle commonly gets. The Mariners would be playing against the Houston Astros. The game started at around 1.
Aw, man. Oh, dang.
The area around the main arena had a cool view of downtown Seattle. Tim arrived at around 2.
Whoa!
Oh, he's out.
Oh, man.
The game ended at around 4.
So how big is Lake Washington?
On our way back to the apartment, we bought some salmon. We grilled it on the sun deck. Afterward, we decided to drive to Lake Washington, a nearby lake, to go swimming. The water was sort of cold, but it was fine. After staying at the lake for 20 minutes, we drove back to the apartment. We left early the next day to do some sightseeing in Seattle. The first place we checked out was a Starbucks Reserve. Starbucks Reserves are very special kinds of Starbucks. They have rare types of coffees, pastries, etc. Only a few of them were built. They also serve their regular products differently than in normal stores. For example, they serve their coffee and hot chocolate in actual mugs and have a cream design on it. Next, we walked to Post Alley where the famous gum wall is. Basically, the walls in the alley were covered in chewing gum stuck to the walls of the alley over the years. It has become quite a popular tourist attraction. I got to stick a piece of gum on one of the walls.
Yes.
3, 2, 1. That means that I have contributed to a popular tourist attraction. Then we walked to the Pike's Place Fish Market, famous for their flying fish. Basically, they throw customers' orders across the market. They also do it for entertainment. One of the fishermen asked if I had tried crab. When I said no, he broke off a crab leg and let me try it. I really enjoyed it.
2 t-shirts on a car. He's contemplating.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
Afterward, we walked by the first Starbucks. It, of course, still had the original logo on it. And yes, this is what the original logo of one of the most famous coffee companies in the world looked like. We didn't go inside because there was a long line and we needed to get to the Space Needle, so I peeked through the window. We took a lift car to the Space Needle and waited in line to go up to the top. The Space Needle is the landmark that defines Seattle as a city. We took the glass elevator up to the observation deck. We had a pretty cool view of the surrounding area. We could see downtown Seattle looking south, Puget Sound looking west, northern Seattle looking north, and the suburbs of Seattle looking east. Recently, there had been a renovation at the Space Needle, during which they replaced the railing with a tilted piece of plexiglass. Dad and Tim got vertigo because of this. I didn't care. After being at the top for 30 minutes, we took the glass elevator down. We ate lunch at a nearby food court. Then we walked to the Chihuly Garden and Glass Museum. The Glass Museum exhibits unique pieces of glass art created by Dave Chihuly. His art is very abstract and beautiful. One exhibit was a garden from another planet. That was probably one of the most beautiful pieces of art that I had ever seen. Another exhibit were 2 wooden boats filled with abstract pieces of glass. There were many other pieces of artwork inside. Outside in the garden, there were many more otherworldly pieces of art that decorated it. The last thing that we did at the museum was to watch a glass blowing demonstration. Glass blowing is basically how the art in the museum is made.
I believe he's making a flower.
Afterward, we took an Uber down to the Boeing Museum of Flight located at the Boeing Field south of downtown. Outside, there was a Trans-Canada Airlines Constellation. The Lockheed Constellation is easily recognizable for its 3 tail fins. It was one of the most popular airliners in the 40s and 50s, notably with TWA. Inside the museum, the first place we visited was the Great Gallery, a giant building that holds many aircraft, both military and civilian. One exhibit was the front half of a US Air 737 that you could walk into. This was the part of the aircraft that had first class. We could also see into the cockpit. Another aircraft was a Lockheed A-2, a spy plane that's very similar to the SR-71. There were also some cockpits that we could sit in. In a room next to the gallery, there were some Apollo exhibits. One of the exhibits was an actual moon rock. There were also the remains of some of the rockets used to launch the Apollo spacecraft. Another exhibit was an actual spacesuit. There were a few other exhibits too. Next, we walked to the Aviation Pavilion, an area that stores a lot of commercial airliners. You can go into most of them. The first aircraft that we went on was a British Airways Concorde. The Concorde was the fastest airliner ever built, flying at 2 times the speed of sound. It flew transatlantic routes originating in Paris or London and ending in New York. It was so fast, it took only 3 hours to fly those routes, half of what it usually takes. The plane, however, consumed a ton of fuel while carrying only 100 passengers, even less than the planes that flew on to Seattle. Because of that, Concorde lost money and was retired in 2003. While inside it, I noticed that Concorde had tiny windows. This is probably because Concorde flew at an altitude of 50,000 feet, where the pressure difference is huge. Concorde's cockpit is probably one of the coolest cockpits that you can find in an aircraft. Next, we checked out SAM 970, the very first Air Force One 707. Inside, there were several large desks, a conference room, a press cabin, and more things you'd expect to find on an Air Force One. The aircraft was probably the oldest aircraft that we went on. Then we went on a United Airlines 727. The 727 was Boeing's trijet. Because of being very efficient for its time, the 727 became a popular airliner for short and medium-haul flights. The cabin was very stylish with seats that had nice patterns on them, one thing that you don't see that often on today's airliners. The 727 was also one of Boeing's last airliners to have a flight engineer position. After that, we went on a Boeing 787. The 787 is one of Boeing's newest airliners. It entered service in 2011. The aircraft is made almost entirely out of composite. Because of that, it is very efficient. Inside there were nice economy and business class seats. The cockpit was very modern with its state-of-the-art controls and instruments. We decided to save the best for last as the final aircraft that we walked on was a Boeing 747. But this wasn't any 747. It was the very first 747 ever built, the first of one of the most successful airliners of all time. We entered the 747 through the front door. On board, there were only 2 rows of seats. The rest of the aircraft had machinery and testing equipment. The really cool spiral staircase was also on display. We exited the plane from the back. There were also many other aircraft on display. The last thing that we did at the museum was to check out the Personal Courage Wing, a facility that displays aircraft from both World Wars. The first floor had aircraft from World War II. These aircraft were very streamlined and could fly at speeds of 300 miles an hour. The second floor housed aircraft from the First World War. These aircraft were mainly biplanes and flew at only 100 miles an hour. When we were outside, we saw the Orbis Flying Eye Hospital, an eye hospital on a DC-10 aircraft. It had been replaced with a new DC-10 and had visited from Pima Air Museum in Arizona. We also saw that Lockheed Constellation from earlier. Afterward, we took an Uber back to Tibbs High-Rise. Later that night, I went out for ramen. This is my first time trying ramen, and I really enjoyed it. We left Seattle the next morning, as that day we were traveling to Canada. Dad and Tim were looking forward to this part of the trip, as they had good memories of freaking indoors. Back in 2003, almost 15 years earlier, Dad, Tim, and Dave, one of their friends, went on a trip there. They stayed at a cabin on Cowichan Lake, a large lake on the island that Regan and Doris used to rent. Dad said it was one of his favorite trips of all time. After driving for about an hour, we stopped at the Funko Pop Factory in Everett, Washington. Dad's a huge fan of Funko Pop, so he wanted to stop there. The area that was open to the public had a lot of giant pop statues. There were separate areas dedicated to each franchise. There was a Star Wars area, It had a lot of Hoth-related stuff. Another area was dedicated to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. One of the statues was of Hulk punching through a wall. Both Dad and I posed with it. Dad's pose was the best, though. Other areas were dedicated to the DC Universe, Disney, and Harry Potter franchises, respectively. There was also a machine making Funko Pops on display. A lot of Pops are being sold in their respective areas, so we bought a few. Soon we continued on. 20 minutes later, we stopped at a rest stop that had a giant tree that you could walk under. Surprisingly, it was not a redwood. Instead, it was a western red cedar. Then we drove on. We drove through the rainforest of northern Washington. At around 2, we finally crossed the border. We were heading to the Tassel-Wind Ferry Terminal, a few miles south of Vancouver. As we neared the terminal, I saw a Canadian freight train. Eventually, we arrived. We were supposed to take a 3 o'clock ferry to Nanaimo. However, we arrived too late for it and instead had to take a 4 o'clock ferry to Swartz Bay. After an hour of waiting, we boarded the ferry.
Dude, look how far forward we're getting. Look how far forward we actually are.
The ferry we were going to be sailing on was BC Ferries Coastal Celebration, one of the 3 coastal class ferries, the largest double-ended ferries in the world. This was actually my first time ever going on a car ferry. 15 minutes after we boarded, the ferry left Tassel-Wind. For the first 30 minutes of the journey, we sailed through the open Strait of Georgia. After sailing the strait, we sailed through some of the narrow channels that surround the dozens of smaller islands found around Vancouver Island. We arrived at Swartz Bay at around 5:30. We continued driving to Cowichan Lake. After traveling for over 9 hours, we finally arrived. Dad and Tim introduced me to Regan and Doris. Soon the sun started to set. We decided to sit around the gas fire on the patio of the house for the evening. The next morning, we got ready to go down to the lake to go swimming. The swim area in this particular lakefront park was pretty cool. It had a water slide and a diving board. At around 2, Regan, who's a volunteer firefighter at the local fire station next to the lake, showed me around the station. He showed me the fire truck and some of the equipment. Then Regan drove the fire truck out onto the station's driveway and let me sit in the driver's seat and blast the sirens.
And then you can...
Wow, that's the same.
Now, say they still don't get out of your way. Pull on that. This.
Whoa. That's cool.
Okay.
After that, he let me try on fireproof clothes. Afterward, Dad, Tim, and I went back to the lake. We spent the remainder of the afternoon relaxing in our inner tubes out of the swim area. We left at around 5. When we got back, Regan's colleague, Aspen, came over for the night. We slept in late the next morning. Dad, Tim, and I got ready to leave to head back to Seattle. We said our goodbyes and left. We were heading to Victoria as we were going to be taking a ferry from there to Port Angeles, a port city located on the Olympic Peninsula, the large peninsula between the Puget Sound and the ocean. We arrived at the Victoria Harbor at around 12:30. Since our ferry wasn't supposed to leave in a couple hours, we decided to explore some of downtown Victoria. We walked by the Victoria Capitol building. It looks similar to the U.S. state capitals, but all of the domes are a bluish-green color, giving it a cool look. Also, when we walked by the harbor, we saw a cool street performance.
2, 3.
Daniel, no!
There were also a lot of totem poles, which you can find a lot of in the Pacific Northwest. We got lunch at a restaurant there, too. The next landmark that we saw was the Empress Hotel, a famous hotel by the harbor. We checked out a few other things, too. We went back to the ferry terminal and boarded the ferry. We were sailing on Black Ball Line's MV Coho. It was the oldest vessel that we sailed on, having entered service in 1971. We left the dock at around 2. We sailed past the Victoria seaplane base. Quite a few seaplanes were coming in and out at that time. We saw a Harbor Air seaplane land. And as we neared the edge of the harbor, we saw a Kenmore Air seaplane take off. When we exited the harbor, we sailed past a cool lighthouse on one of the harbor's breakwaters. However, we noticed that there was a fog bank between Port Angeles and us, meaning that we were going to be sailing through fog. About halfway into our voyage, we reached the fog bank. They cleared the front deck so a crew member could stand and watch for obstacles in the water. It was quite eerie being in that fog. It was something that you see a lot in shipwreck movies. Now that's probably the creepiest thing that I've seen while on a ship so far. We broke out of the fog just a few miles away from Port Angeles. We arrived at 4:45 p.m. What was it, that guy in front of us? We decided to drive to the Kingston Harbor to catch a ferry to Edmonds, located north of Seattle.
We've done a lot of things.
And it's a drawbridge. I can't remember.
Oh, it lives on the bridges.
Roll.
Rolls, right?
Although that's not really true.
This, I believe, is the Virginia Narrows, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I might be wrong.
We arrived at Kingston 2 hours after arriving in Port Angeles. This time we were sailing on a Washington State ferry ship. The ferry had arrived at the harbor a few minutes after we had.
Big ferry, actually.
It was around 7 when we boarded.
Oh, we're going up.
We left Kingston a few minutes later. It was a 20-minute trip to Edmonds, completed under the setting sun. We reached Edmonds at 7:30 p.m.
It's the home stretch. We got anything coming up here?
Negatory gas right?
Oh, it's a little shaky.
Then we continued on. After traveling for 10 hours, we arrived. When it was dark, we decided to go to the sun deck one last time. It was nice seeing the bright city lights light up the area. We left very early to go to the airport to board our plane back to San Diego, this time a direct flight. The plane was supposed to be leaving at 6:45 a.m., but was delayed until 12 due to a mechanical issue with the aircraft. That's right, the flight was delayed for over 5 hours. To pass the time, I went to a nearby Delta gate that had a view of the runway and did some plane spotting. Eventually, we boarded the aircraft. While taxiing to the runway, we saw China Airlines Cargo 747. We took off at around 1.
Oh, I think we're rolling. Oh, we're rotating. Here we go. Nice. We're airborne. Shit. Oh, wow, we see 2 Alaska jets down there. Virgin America plane. That's cool. And look at this. Whoa.
We reached our cruising altitude a few minutes later. Over Northern California, there was a ton of smoke covering a huge area, so large that it took 45 minutes to cross it. We reached the edge of the smoke cloud over the South Central Valley. Soon we passed over the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles, where we began our descent into San Diego.
I think it made our final turn into the airport.
We landed at around 3. We arrived at the gate several minutes later.